Good evening and welcome to the Viva Cost podcast. My name is Graham and tonight I'm joined by Alison Graham. Hello, Alison.
Hi, Graham. How are you?
I'm very good. It's been a while since we've done one of these, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. There's been a few illnesses and holidays and various things going on, but yeah, hopefully that's us back now. So
I think illness has taken over, kind of
yeah,
the
absolutely.
name of the game. However, we have quite exciting. We've prepared a show tonight. We actually have prepared for what we're going to do tonight, ever so slightly. There are some words on paper, which is better than normal. So I feel almost stupid asking, but what's been happening? What's the word on the street? What's
Well,
new?
I think, just to kind of clarify why we've, for the first time ever, actually written something down as a kind of vague agenda, is just because there's so much happening just now. There's just so much in the news, so much to unpack. So I think, that kind of drove us to think, what is the kind of key topics that are going on? How do we start to unpack that and kind of drive that conversation down? So it's hard to avoid what's been going on in the news, not that far from me, actually, in kind of Stirlingshire, with the rapist who was put into a women's jail in Cornwall Vale. So I think what that's really done is a number of things over the last few weeks. Obviously, we talked a bit before Christmas about the legislation that was going through the GRR bill. But the whole aspect, I think, of self-ID is actually the kind of critical thing that's come up, and what somebody who's obviously been a convicted rapist who has been defended and claimed he didn't do it. So, at what point do we actually trust people's word of, who they say they are, and this opportunity to exploit, and where that goes and how we look at the ramifications for society from that. So I think that's really started to get into the mainstream media, and it's started, people to ask questions. And for me, it kind of comes back to the whole reason many people from the get-go said, this is complex, this is something that really needs a calm, cool heads, balanced views, time to really scrutinise and look at the outcomes. And that's why, for me and many other people, a citizens' assembly would have been the way to do this, because at some point politicians have to get this stuff in front of the public. By, obviously there's a lot of kind of controversy over the Section 35 that the Secretary of State, Alistair Jack, has used to block the bill from getting royal assent. And that's kicked up a kind of furore. So we can possibly kind of get into some of that and looking at, what devolution is, what it does, what independence would do, how that affects our legislation in Scotland. But I think for now, the kind of key thing is at the moment that the public are now being involved in this, bigger debate. And really it's incumbent on politicians to take a public view and to do that in a way that doesn't make things worse and more toxic, and it doesn't put anybody in any level of harm. And that's why, we really quickly have to get some, as we say, grown-ups in the room at a level to try and take kind of some control around this, and start to listen to different sides. And I don't mean like both sides of whatever. I mean, it's a bit like saying have a balanced view, bring on a rapist, to kind of give their viewpoint. I don't mean that. I mean a balanced view of the issues from, professionals, all across, which is what a citizens' assembly would have done, because it would have allowed scrutiny from all sides of, medical, ethical, public policy making, which I think we'll kind of come on to talk about as well. So yeah, that's one of the many things that's been happening. But I think there's a big kind of interrelationship of where politics is going at the moment, and I think that's something that will be really interesting to see how things develop in the weeks and months to come.
So let's take it in turn. So self-ID is obviously very topical, and it's worth stressing because it gets lost somewhat. The law actually for the gender recognition certificates and the Gender Recognition Act, they haven't actually been legally assented yet. So they're not actually in they're not in effect just now, and we're already we've already got one of the hurdles that was brought up in the Parliament. It was suggested in the Parliament, and there was an amendment put forward to say that that certainly when it came to women's segregated prisons, that there should be no male-bodied or penis wielders in in the police, because effectively rape is, I mean, rape statistically, or I don't mean statistically, technically, has to occur by somebody who has a penis. There's no other, you know, the definition of rape is someone with a penis.
Yeah.
You know, I'm being obvious here that, you know, if you have a penis and you rape, you have to be male-bodied in the sense that that's who you are, and that is the situation we're in. This is a situation that we've been told could never happen. And yes, the prison service or the First Minister or someone has intervened and said, you know, we're not going to put a rapist in a women's prison. But the truth is, at some point, that was the actual plan. The plan was to take someone who identifies as a woman, who his wife identifies as saying that they've made it up to get an easier life and get into a women's prison rather than a men's prison. We are there. Like, this is the situation that we're told we'd never find ourselves in. That we, you know, there was a lot of scaremongering, and there was a lot of argument that this was somehow something that would never occur, but here we are. So it makes me question, because it's prescient only because we've just had the debate where we've, you know, been reassured that this couldn't happen and there are safeguards in place. Well, the safeguard that seems to have kicked in is public outrage. We cannot count on public outrage, and we cannot count on the idea that everything will be public enough that in every situation where safeguarding may come up like this. And I don't just mean in prisons. But, you know, it was, what was it? It was said that the rapist, and we're not going to name the rapist because we're not going to do that. We're not going to hero worship any. You know, there's a big thing in American news just now about you should never kind of say the name of the perpetrator because it glorifies them in some way. So we'll be careful not to do that. But we're in a situation where this person, you know, was doing some sort of tanning classes, and we've now got the news coming out today that people who were in the tanning classes feel, you know, violated in the sense they had to strip down in front of them. And I think, you know, this raises more questions about where are the safeguards then?
Yeah, I think that's a key thing. You know, people will always, if they've got malintent, they will look for loopholes, they will look to exploit that. And I think, you know, the general public have got a perception that our laws, our legislators put things in place to protect us. And, you know, this is one of the big things I think that needs to really get better. A lot of the issues with the bill, and it was, I mean, the GRA has been there since 2004, the Quality Act of 2010. So the GRR, which was the reforms of the Gender Recognition Act, to make it easier, which I don't think anybody that I've ever spoken to has got any issues with making people's lives easier. But there is, you know, like the Equality Act, which absorbed 11, I think, pieces of legislation. It's a bit of that very fine balancing act of how do you balance rights and protections across different, you know, protected characteristics. So this is where it's really key, when you see legislators literally pushing stuff over the wall to be someone else's problem to implement. And that's why we've got a hate crime bill that is nearly 2 years old from Royal Assent, still sitting on the shelf, unimplemented, because legislators have put law in that, you know, that those in the police and the judiciary that have to actually implement this as law, you know, are really struggling. And, you know, it does make you think, what was the purpose of fast track? I mean, I'm so done with people telling me that they've been talking about this for 6 years. It's like doing a PhD for 6 years. It doesn't mean you're going to pass if you've actually not followed the right structure and you've not actually done original research and had good communication with your supervisor and everything. So that's just a nonsense. Elapsed time equates to good law. Proper regular scrutiny does. And that's why in 6 years, I just think 6 years and you didn't do a citizens' assembly, that would have been the obvious way to bring public opinion together. Police do police by consent. So society has to adhere to something that is recognised as the common good. And I think once you lose that, you really, really do put the pressure onto the police to actually, you know, uphold a law that society don't agree with. And, you know, you could end up in a myriad of legal cases of unintended consequence. There's so many parts of this that it touches in people's lives. We've got protected characteristics of age, when you're changing your legal documentation, at that point, if you are like a rapist denied access to a women's prison estate, could actually take them to court, let the prison service to court, or I don't know if it's them they would sue, or whoever, but if you're legally your legal sex, is what you are going to rely on, then it's just so wide ranging what can happen here. There's cases that really need to be aligned with, what about the divorce law? At the moment it's 2 years, which aligns with the 2 years for a GRC. What if, somebody's, partner decides to change their legal sex in their birth certificate, but their marriage certificate's in a different sex, and you can't change that arbitrarily because it's a legal contract between two parties, and what if they don't approve, and how do you get divorced? And it's just a minefield.
That came up as well. I remember that. That was almost an amendment or a committee or something. And they said, would it be transphobia if you married, one gender and the person then regendered themselves? Would you be transphobic to say you weren't in a relationship,
Well, it's like a breach of contract. Regardless, taking the emotion out of it, it's a breach of contract. That's not what you contracted to do in your marriage contract. And this is where you start to have conflicting rights and balance and protections. And to really protect, it's been said, marginalised community, whatever, to really protect people, and the unintended consequences of this, unfortunately, will probably harm the community that they were intended to protect the most, because they're the community that like this rapist who has lied about a myriad of things, but is taken at face value that they've changed gender. Now, if you take that to its conclusion, look, where are the protections and safeguards in anything that we do? How do people know? Do you have to wait till reactively somebody's committed a crime like this before you actually start to scrutinise? Or safeguards are supposed to be there to prevent. Safeguards are supposed to be there to give assurance, and even if it's a low, probability is what comes out. Probability and severity come into risk management. So you look at the probability, but you also have to look at the severity. You have to look at, well, what is the severity? If severity is high enough, even if the probability is low, you still have to protect. And the way that I've over the years had to do, I can't remember what you call it. It's for doing things like bikeability at school and stuff. PVG, is it PVG clearance?
Your disclosure.
Disclosure, yeah, Disclosure Scotland. So, but once you start to get people changing their identity, as this individual has changed their name, so the college you talked about earlier, this person enrolled in the college under a different name. So how do public bodies and universities and colleges, etc., how are they expected to take the burden of trying to work out if everybody is telling the truth, if we don't actually have some very, very clear safeguards that if you have got a conviction for a sexual offence, that should be the safeguard, that you do not have access to this if you have that, because at that point people have got some level of assurance for the most severe risk.
Do you know what's quite interesting? When you bring that up? This is a small piece of evidence that was submitted. It said that criminals are very likely to change their name. And a lot of the time it is legally, and it is by deed poll and such, because it allows because they count on the fact that effectively not everybody is able to process and does the disclosure, because certainly when you change your name it isn't a disclosure check. However, not everything checks that automatically, so you instantly create a new identity. It's a very common thing for criminals to create multiple identities, to therefore have aliases and known names. And I'm not, by the way, just to state, we're not saying by any stretch of the imagination that everybody who's trans is going to be a criminal. What we're stating is that there's obfuscation that is used by opportunists who will identify as trans as we've now seen, that people will change their name, will change their identity, will change everything they possibly can to make themselves very, very hard to find and to ensure that justice. So this has all come up, though. This is not new. This has come up in the Parliament, and I think you were saying the Citizens' Assembly. But, you know, in the absence of the Citizens' Assembly, which would probably be the best way to deal with this, we have two other things that we should consider. Number one is, I've seen Stuart Campbell of Wings put up a rather interesting one that says, why don't we have a referendum on it? Why don't you put it to the public? And I think that comes to the root of why we didn't have a Citizens' Assembly.
Yeah.
Because I don't think the Scottish Government, the ministers of the Scottish Government, or the First Minister, would have got the output from the Citizens' Assembly that necessarily would have allowed them to move forward in the manner that they have.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, if we're talking about public policy making and why we should have Citizens' Assembly, it's interesting that we don't go back to the root of it and say, well, why did we not? Because the truth is, they didn't really want, they already, you know, through polling, we know it's quite a controversial piece of legislation, and we know that it wouldn't have, in its current form, managed to get through. It managed to clear the Parliament, but that's a lot of whipping and a lot of
But what's the
political
point
game.
on a shelf unimplemented? Who are you actually serving? This is the point. So just back to that point, because I kind of forgot, lost my thread, but you just reminded me there that this rapist, this is what the worry is, that this rapist potentially is actually impersonating a trans person, which puts the trans community at risk. And this is what self-ID does. The GRR doesn't mention trans once. You know, it's kind of in the public mind that this is about, you know, trans people, but it doesn't mention trans. Self-ID is about anybody. Anybody can self-identify. And, you know, there's so many unanswered questions about what does living in your gender mean and how is it monitored? So, and what are the penalties? I mean, they've talked loosely about penalties without really involving, you know, the people who will need to implement this. And one of the things I read recently from somebody from the Police Federation, I believe, was that the late amendment, I think it was Jelly Martin's amendment, that kind of, they reckoned, you know, trumped, I think it was Russell Finlay amendment and Michelle Thompson's amendment. But they were saying that the police had no sight of that. That came in at stage 3. They had no sight of an amendment that they are going to get left to carry the can to implement. Now, if you've got criminals with criminal intent, you know, doing things for, you know, bad purposes, you would overwhelm the system. And, you know, if people, like you were saying about disclosure checks, the way to break a system is to overwhelm it. And there are so many things that are built on a poor assumption about volume. And I read the thing from, what you call him, that used to be the Labour guy, see his face. He was the Lord Chancellor.
It's not like he used to struggle.
No, he was a Lord Chancellor under Blair. Scottish guy. I'll come back to him. Anyway, he was asked, and people were holding that up as, oh, he says that, you know, they've got a good chance. Now, there's 2 Supreme Court judges, or ex-Supreme Court judges, including Lord Hope, who have said that, you know, there's very low likelihood that they will win a judicial review. And I think, you know, we'll kind of definitely kind of unpack what the whole Section 35 thing's all about and how we fix this. And I think a lot of the sensible, you know, commentators have been saying this is Scotland's problem, we have to fix it in Scotland. But that's not to say, you know, the rhetoric of it's undemocratic and it's attacking devolution, that's just political pantomime. It's in the Devolution Act, it's in the Scotland Act, it is actually a section. And, you know, if you read it, what it does say, Section 33 and all this nonsense about why did you not you know, say before, but there's been a lot of commentary from, you know, like equal rights and, you know, people actually trying to raise the issues of what the overall impact on Equality Act, which is reserved law, which affects the whole of the UK, and unfortunately Scotland's still part of the UK, so we have to deal with the reality we're in, rather than, you know, as I think too often legislators are doing these days, and it's very dangerous. They are reading the law the way they want it to be, rather than the way it actually is, and not really making that proper case of, you know, why they want to change it. And I think there is a lot of pantomime and a lot of political games going on at the moment, and I don't think that actually helps. We really need to look at the situation as it stands. We've said before, if you were going to go for, you know, if you were going to goad the UK government into coming after you, do it about independence. Get the public behind you, you know, attacking devolution. There is a democratic case there about, you know, we say no in the state.
It's a huge whataboutery, though. I mean, it's a fake argument because it's. I mean, the First Minister. I don't know if it was this morning or yesterday morning or something. She went on an interview and she said that, this is striking at the heart of devolution. It's against that it's, an equal right, it's an equality thing, it's a rights thing, it's a human rights thing, and actually the people who are advancing any gender critical views are, I can't remember her exact turn of phrase, but it was very much along the lines that, well, they're probably homophobic and they're probably racist.
Racist.
And, it was, and the odd thing is, though,
really poor.
and the thing that struck me, that it was very poor of her. It was really, really low bar, especially for a First Minister of Nicola Sturgeon's calibre in media. Very poor. But, she said that it was analogous and these people would probably homophobes and stuff. But I'm really sorry. Two of the people that, that I scroll past on Twitter each day, Joanna Cherry is she's a lesbian. And Neil Hanvey's a gay man.
Yep.
So, I mean, I'm not saying that you cannot be homophobic if you're gay, but, I mean, there's a huge proportion of people within the LGB community who feel as though this is being made into an issue for them that they actually do not lend support to. And they quite rightly are like, whoa, this I'm not.
The most dangerous thing is, particularly from somebody in such a senior position, is to normalise this just throwing out of, insults. It's like a scattergun approach to make people close down. And, I come back to the Citizens' Assembly idea, which, if you look at Ireland, they ratified their result with a national referendum. Had Scotland taken that tact, we would have shown we were truly progressive in participatory democracy. We would be truly progressive in actually seeking out the foundation of a Scottish constitution by asking the basic questions on balanced rights and protections of the people who live here, who visit here. That would have been a very strong case. It would have been very difficult for the UK government to do anything on, because we would have had the backing of the Scottish population. But this has come through a whipped vote at a parliament. I mean, if you look at the committee stage, and I refer back to my 6 years of, elapsed time does not good legislation make. If you look at some of the absolute horror stories of people who weren't listened to, victims of domestic violence, it's like, we will listen where we want to listen, and subjective listening, again, does not good legislation make. And this is the problem. At some point, you have to implement this law. How are you going to do that with a public that are against it? You are opening a can of worms with self-ID. This has nothing to do with anybody's rights. This is about people who can just self-declare. I know a lot of people, I think 20% of Scotland is disabled. If they could self-declare to the DWP and they would, that would be fine, then I'm sure a lot of people's lives would be much easier. But, that is not the case. And what happened about age? I mean, there's some horror stories across the world that you hear of people, and even within Scotland, within the prison state. I was reading about somebody out of jail in Polmont who self-declares as a baby girl and, insists on their rights to have their nappy changed and stuff. I mean, some of this stuff is truly bonkers. But, once you open in a box, you actually start to, you're on catch-up rather than taking a cool, calm view of this and looking proactively at how we do this.
Nicola Sturgeon, again, First Minister, taking it as her. And this, by the way, comes down to Nicola Sturgeon shouting about how everybody else hasn't read up on it, and she's the person who knows the majority about this.
Yeah.
We've all educated ourselves, and the First Minister's obviously got all the answers here. But she was on a radio interview during the week, and I took great. I took great pleasure in noticing that she actually hadn't bothered to check, because she, first of all, said that we should, she was questioned. It was, well, why at 16 is this a thing? Because surely, and I think the general argument is maybe we should wait until puberty's finished, because we're saying that, during puberty you're going through massive changes, hormonal and kind of, developmental change, fundamental change to your body. Perhaps you should wait until that settles before you know where your baseline is to change from. Yeah. But she said, well, maybe we need to look at a drink law, because you can't drink at 16. You aren't able to drink at 16. And she said, maybe we should have a look at that. Maybe 16-year-olds can decide whether or not they can drink. However, it was interesting, because she then rode it back and said that's not quite what she meant. She didn't actually mean they should be able to drink. But what's quite interesting is then the one of the licensing lawyers I was reading on Twitter from Glasgow said, actually, the First Minister seems oblivious to the fact that 16-year-olds can drink, they can have wine with their family while they're having a meal in a restaurant or a pub. Like, this is already legal. It is already legal that 16-year-olds can drink. So it shows you that when we're discussing these rights, the First Minister not only went out there and says, oh, well, maybe we should give them more rights, she then wrote it back saying she was totally misrepresented and actually she didn't mean that. And then I don't think she realised that actually they had that right anyway.
Well, there was something else she got wrong that I noticed, and I know this because we've got a kind of friend who was in the services, that, you know, she said, and you can join the army, but you can't join the army at 16 without parental consent. So, you know, that is actually quite a key thing, you know, when you start to look at, well, you can do this, but you can't do that. Now, again, it comes back to, you need to look at this in the whole, rather than looking at the piecemeal pieces and then wondering why the jigsaw doesn't fit together. You need to actually look at, well, what are we trying to do? What are we looking at from you know, the capacity? You know, it's all about capacity, you know, children, minors, adults within capacity, how they need more safeguarding. And to say, you know, to lower the bar, you know, lowers the bar on safeguarding as well, of them actually getting more support. If you're going through, you know, as a lot of kids, you know, and I've said this since the get-go of COVID, all people on the front line, all kids particularly, you know, who are very socially transitioning years, that a lot of kids are really, really struggling, you know, back at school and with, you know, potentially bereavements and family breakups and all sorts of things, which have always happened, but, you know, exacerbated by COVID and lockdown and everything. And, you know, have been through a global pandemic when they were basically told to fear things. And now a lot of kids have got hugely, you know, problematic anxiety that's causing them barriers across their life. So they've got a lot going on. You know, to look at all kids with as additional support needs, to say basically you're fine, you don't have to tell your parents, we can do this, we can do that. And, you know, to feel that there's a magic bullet to their lives, where actually the kids really just need support and a very understanding, open conversation about, you know, what their options are. But any, you know, adult who works with kids will tell you that you need to give them space. You know, you don't want to like get them to make decisions they can't move back from. And this is where it gets really, you know, we need a lot more medical evidence on what, you know, as we're starting to see out of countries like Sweden, on medicalisation and what the impacts are, to make sure that people, particularly, you know, minors and, you know, people who are still developing, understand the effects, you know, because what might be you think is the right thing for you now may change, you know, in years to come. And, you know, you can just see a litany of lawsuits, you know, in years to come, you know, with kids who grow up to be infertile, who then, you know, have like class actions against government stuff. I mean, it's actually quite horrific. And then when you start to peel back and look at, you know, the root cause of a lot of this, you know, fast tracking beyond, you know, ahead of evidence, like medical evidence, ahead of the law in a lot of cases, you start to see that the prison situation was kind of the test bed, which really makes me quite upset to think, you know, this is vulnerable women who a lot of who've been through victims of domestic violence and sexual assault themselves, but they really are a captive audience, you know, pardon the pun, you know, and they don't have an option, and it really erodes consent, you know, like their consent, you know, what are you going to do, ask every single, you know, person in a unit, do they get a say? What if one person says no? They, you know, that's not going to happen. You know, you've heard all this stuff from the prison service about they will not keep people in isolation long term. You know, they will very rapidly try to bring people into the general population. There's a whole array of things. Even the safety of the individual themselves. You know, you have to look at what is the right solution for each of these things, but to do that you have to have a calm head when you're doing it. You have to take the emotion out and look at it very objectively. You need to look at all the different potential outcomes and make sure you mitigate, you know, the risk of, you know, unintended consequences happening, and, you know, optimise your chance of actually achieving what you want to achieve without causing additional problems. And there's so much of that that's now gone into schools, it's gone into hospitals, like the NHS and stuff. The thing in schools that I think should be, you know, an absolute red line is that lobbyists should not be involved in schools. And when you start to see some of the people, the lobby groups that are involved in schools and writing school policy, And then you start to see that, some of them are being investigated by the Charities Commission, some are being investigated by the police. I mean, where is the duty of care from legislators to actually allow policy?
To be fair though, that's not new. I mean,
No, I'm not saying it's new. I'm not saying it's new, but we're now starting to see some of these outcomes. And this is, at some point people say, it's a little bit like nobody takes responsibility. You don't know where the liability lies. Well, you absolutely do once it ends up in court, because that is, the job is to find where does the buck stop. And this is, I think, that a lot of people who are thinking they're taking the easy path just now are really setting themselves up for future potential litigation.
I mean, the indoctrination at school and some random organisations is not new. I mean, obviously, I've not recently been in school, but I remember in primary and high school in Scotland, and I wasn't a religious school at all, but we still got to hear the Christian ceremony, we got the Christian anthems belted out at assembly, I didn't at the time think much of it, because at the time I would have thought, oh well, this is just what you do, you sit in a room and you listen to this. But it's interesting because now, I'm a lot older and I reflect on, my religion and the fact that I don't have a religion. And I think that, I actually think most religion is absolute bonkers and mess. And the overall conclusion is, though, there are people who were swept up in that. There are people who are dragged into that. And it becomes, a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you go into a school and you're like, oh, this is quite mainstream, and like 50% of people should be doing this, 50%. I remember doing random things in school where I think that, on reflection, you were getting taken down a path that didn't really exist. Now, I'm kind of undoing my own argument, because it couldn't have been that bad, because I came out an atheist.
Maybe that was
maybe the indoctrination was not strong enough to take hold. But
it's a really good point. But I have to say, I've got friends who are very religious, and their kids at school were allowed to come out of religious education. It was optional. They had the consent to withdraw consent, and I don't think a lot of the things that are happening now, there is any option to withdraw consent, particularly when you're looking at, there was a big controversy before about like shared bathrooms, and you get like pre-pubescent and pubescent, like boys and girls, young people. That can be a very difficult time. And
you set me a challenge actually on that. I remember because I said to you that the high schools surrounding us had mixed bathrooms. So we've had that in certain schools in Fife for a good while before the kind of the whole picture came out here. And I remember, so I went and asked, and I was told that the open bathroom, that's what they call it, the open bathroom policy, because every bathroom is a cubicle and it has like a public communal wash hand basin area. And I remember you said, you told me to go and speak to, if I knew anybody, and certainly I do know a couple of family members and people who I know that are younger and still at high school, and I asked them, I said, what do you think of the mixed bathrooms? And you were 100% on the money when you said that in general girls avoid going to the toilet, maybe not entirely, but when it's busy during a lunchtime or a break time, they find it intimidating to go into the bathroom. And they didn't say it was because they didn't have any sort of sexual assault fears or anything, but they were saying in general the boys were always throwing wet paper towels about and always being quite boisterous, and they were always kind of just being, little boys. Yeah. And it's interesting because you told me to go and ask, and when I did ask, the feedback that I know is anecdotal, but the feedback I got is that in general girls do avoid mixed sex and even open, because these are fully open, you can see into them, but they're not open for where you actually do the toilet, they're open for where you wash your hands and such. And even then, the anti-bullying bathrooms, as they've been described as, seem to have a knock-on effect that a lot of people are like, I just don't use them.
Mm-hmm. And this is a problem. To tackle bullying by the shape of the bathroom, rather than tackling bullying as a cultural thing in the school, and we could go on and on about that. I mean, that's been in the news as well, about the video with the girl getting battered in the class, and I can assure you, I have lots of examples of similar at schools, people I actually know and know their kids, or know the kind of background to things. And again, it's trying to tackle what is the actual needs of kids to get kids into like a safe emotional state, and not just do the easy things. It seems to be easy in the short term to just say oh yeah, absolutely, you don't have to speak to your parents, you can like affirm like gender, and if kids are communicating, they need to be listened to for sure. But this whole assumption that parents are bad is really dangerous, particularly there's, despite like disclosure and everything, there's even one of my old school teachers turned out he was done for like sexual assault and stuff. There's bad people get into positions, and particularly where they can access vulnerable people or potential victims. We really need to be
safeguard.
Well, it's one of the reasons that the named person bill fell down. It was about like breaking the kind of rights of the family, and there's a lot of we didn't get it this time. Let's keep bashing away at something that there's fundamental impacts to society to all this. That we need to really understand, how do we get like inclusive is a very overused word at the moment, but really to have an inclusive conversation, to make sure we really do understand what the balanced rights and protections are for everybody, to live in a way that is safe, that is respectful, and doesn't put people at unnecessary risk. And the first and last consideration of any policy should be safeguarding. I don't know why that would ever be controversial. Safeguarding the vulnerable, whether it's children, whether it's adults with limited or no capacity. Like people, my mum is, in a care home. She had a stroke, and my mum is completely reliant on people doing the right thing. And this is where I really do. And we've got a lot of, we've got friends who are disabled, who rely again on all the other people to do things. And when people are in a vulnerable situation, we need to be absolutely certain that we have done all we can to ensure consent, to ensure safeguarding, and to really, start to look beyond just a very myopic view of, we need, everybody needs to agree. If I say I'm this, I am this. And it's like, and that's regardless of anything that you say you are. Do you know what I mean? If you said you were, like a brain surgeon, and just rock up at a hospital, people are not going to take you at face value. You would have to actually, have some kind of credentials. And it really, it does worry me that the kind of demedicalisation on the one hand, but the kind of medicalisation on the other hand, if you've got a vulnerable child for whatever reason, who is self-harming or having, massive, anxiety issues, and it's barriers to them, being happy and succeeding, in what they want to do and to achieve, you would look at the child in the whole. I don't see whether there's any factor of that wouldn't just always look at the child in the whole and make sure that you have got to the root cause, you've understood why certain, like behaviours, whatever.
That's the key point by the detransition movement. The people who have transitioned and now detransitioning, they say that they felt that the one part of their, the one part of something they said was taken very seriously, but the whole picture or the whole game was not looked at as a whole and understood. And they say that they were often quite railroaded into decisions that, they were told this will solve everything and then didn't. However, I'm conscious we're pushing on for time, so this leads us into kind of part 3, which is that this has been massively protested, along with lots of other things, and there's a lot that's going on just now. So we have union strikes going on up and down the country. We have protests over the GRC. We have protests over Scottish independence. We have, Brexit is the eternal let's get back into the EU, let's keep Brexit solid thing. We've got all this protest, and I presume when you've said protests and politicians, we're moving on to the fact that it seems our politicians have become even more estranged or even less interested in actually what's being protested and what they can do about it. It seems like for now anyway, the politicians do not hear what the people are saying.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I really wanted to look at here was, as a politician, turning up to some protests but not other protests is actually, people are looking at where you don't protest as well as where you do. And that was something that struck me, all the controversy over the protests in Glasgow, where there was the offensive signs and stuff that were up, and there was police, I think it was a report to police or something on that, as I don't know, won't kind of talk too much about that because I don't know what the details of that are. But the individuals that were there, MPs and MSPs, I was at the, like we mentioned before, I was at the Supreme Court protest about Scottish independence, and none of them were there. And it's ironic considering that's why they're in power, that's why they're in a job. Yeah, it seems this kind of selectiveness, and lots of people across the independence movement will say there's certain politicians that will show up. They've done rallies, they go to the local march, they'll be leading the banner at the front, and there's others that really don't. And I think it's something that's come up kind of time and again after nearly 9 years now in power. I don't think Nicola Sturgeon's ever been at an independence march. Given that she is leading the party and the Scottish Government that were empowered on the basis to deliver that. I mean, they didn't go from 6 MPs to 56 MPs just because we thought, they'd sparkling personalities. Because let's be honest, I think there was only 6 before, so 50 people got elected because there was a national mood after the independence referendum. Failed, had this massive energy, and I think that was what people poured into the SNP, thinking, get behind it, final push. But I think it's now starting to become kind of more evident. I think only one time there was a thing at George Square. It was very controlled. It was all about the national and stuff, and there was specific speakers and what have you. And it was the last speaker Nicola was on, and there's lots of pictures about it, and whatever. But you start to kind of unpick all that and think, well, wait a minute, what actually is the role of politicians in protests, and is the grassroots where politicians should be, or are they hampering that movement? Because in 2013-14, a lot of the real traction that we got was through groups like RIC knocking doors and signing people up who'd not voted since poll tax days or ever, to be on the electoral roll and to actually vote for something, because they felt finally there was something that was worth doing, that they could actually have this binary decision to vote for, should Scotland be an independent country. And since then, I think politics has conflated all of that, and there's a lot of, this was in our manifesto, even if it was in subsection 3 of page 67 and it was in white font, and you're like, well, what was your headline of your constitution and why you're put in power? If you officially dropped independence and you ran on a manifesto, a bit like you're doing with the referendum, would you be elected on the things you're currently focusing on? Because there's a whole bunch of stuff, removing juries from rape trials and stuff, that the legal fraternity are very, very concerned about a lot of this. This is fundamentally changing the way we do law in Scotland, and that is not something that should be done lightly.
No, it shouldn't. I did take note. I mean, it's interesting that you sort of raised that example of the politicians who were in Glasgow, and they were found to be, in fact, I think one of the signs was decapitate TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists. And it was, I believe it was 4 elected members of the SNP. Well, the one that I was, there's 2 things that kind of stuck out here, and one was SNP and one was Lib Dem. So, and the first one was
Greens were both there, all there.
Yeah, Alex Cole-Hamilton was having some sort of moment to himself where he was dedicating the entire of the GRR to 1 or 2 activists that he particularly likes, which was a bizarrity. It was like, we're doing it for you. Like, that's not quite how politics works.
That's not really how legislation works. And he looked like Dr. Strange. I saw somebody saying that on Twitter with the dark gloves and the long black coat. It was like quite a sinister look. I don't know who was advising him on that. Yeah.
Well, but then we had Stuart MacDonald, and I'm not a fan of Stuart MacDonald at all. Stuart MacDonald is, as a politician, I absolutely loathe the man. I think his politics are dreadful.
You mean?
And it comes about because, well, Stuart MacDonald's one of these. So he's gone to this rally because he's an ally or some sort of, he's affiliated, he's selling to the success, and he wasn't in the Scottish Parliament, so he needed to find a way to attach himself to the current glory that apparently is being spread. And he turned up and said he didn't see any of the signs. He was just, part of the atmosphere. He was just in the pictures, and he didn't see them and was disgusted by them, which is the first time he's been disgusted by them, because quite frankly they've been attacking his colleague Joanna Cherry since 2015, and Stuart MacDonald has not reached out and said, I stand with Joanna Cherry against this horrific abuse from people who, many of them, are in the bloody Scottish National Party. And then secondly, when we talk about contribution to independence and the full-throated argument, let's move on and let's get independence done, which is what we're looking for and what the raison d'etre of the party is. You look, and Stuart MacDonald, he coughed up his NATO paper that was roundly sort of mocked by the sort of press and the NATO sort of, the commentators that did bother to commentate were like, this man has no idea how NATO works.
Yeah.
His contribution is...
Even the line was used apparently was 10 years old.
Yeah, but this it just comes back to like it's all look at I've made a substantive contribution to NATO. No, you've not. NATO didn't even read your bit of paper. They were quite frankly in the middle of trying to stop World War III across in Ukraine from the Russians. They're not reading your little bit of paper that says you demand this and you demand that, and there'll be no Stuart MacDonald, the Scottish National Party, the third party in Westminster. It's, a man who, has all the wherewithal in the world to tell NATO what it's doing, but apparently is unable to understand the nuance of the signs that are directly behind him.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I did think
I'm going to lecture the free world on how it's going to run, its largest military organisation, while I'm also incapable of reading the banner that's behind me. And it just speaks to the lack of talent. It speaks to the lack of, these people, love them or hate them, but Alex Salmond would not have been in front of a banner that he shouldn't have been. He would, very purposeful man, would have had taken stock his side and been like, well, that's not quite, or he would have taken it on. That would have been the principled stance, is to say, actually, this shouldn't be on. This is not what this is about. This is about something completely different. We're surrounded by these feckless, pathetic...
Exactly. There's two things for me that, the defence of, as an elected, paid politician, that I don't know what's going on around me is quite the take, But the other thing, that these people who are all, elected politicians, two of them were actually on the NEC. In fact, three of them were on the NEC when I was on, and Joanna Cherry was also on. And I can assure you, not one of them supported Joanna Cherry when, the rape threats that were then convicted from a party member, which was denied during the NEC, even though it was a fact, because I was the regional rep, I'd actually seen the email. So this just really does start to make you, once somebody tells you something factually is different, and even when you give them a kind of bit of an out to correct it and they don't, and you start to see, wait a minute, hang on, party spin is more important than personal safety. I mean, women in the area had asked for help, and I was representing them, and I'd asked for help. And what should they do? Should they speak to the police? Their personal details were on the party site, that was accessible to members, and I was just closed down for this. But the other thing I was just going to say, if those politicians had taken a stand, you were talking about like Alex Salmond. So if you had a politician who turned around and said, "Get that down. I'm going to notify the police. This is not what this is about. This is about a positive, whatever. I mean, everybody's got the right to protest, absolutely. But, when you start, one of the other signs I saw, which in many ways I think was even more sinister, was this time it's placards, next time it won't be. What on earth? This is really quite sinister. But for them, they had the opportunity to take a stand and actually set a tone. And I think that's what we really lack in politics. We lack, people taking the right tone. To set that tone for everybody else, because it becomes an enablement. It becomes a kind of free for all into only then, I mean, there was somebody, one of the elected members who was at that protest. Saying about Nicola Sturgeon throwing out the kind of tropes about homophobia and misogyny and whatever. I mean, that's pretty defamatory. If that's the case, name names and let's see that play out. But this way of trying to close people down by throwing out, really offensive insults. I had that happen to me at the NEC for trying to raise a point of policy and look at as a problem solver and troubleshooter to look at where a policy that a lawyer, a QC had said was, the legal advice was not to do it, which was ignored. I get told that what I'd said was the talk of a white supremacist, and I was like, "Are you actually kidding me on?" But I was actually shut down because I was so gobsmacked, and I was like, "I'm sorry, what?" And it's just really, really dangerous, particularly for people who are in elected office, to set these tones. And how do we ever move on as a society if we start to go down that kind of track? It's the other thing I think is quite disingenuous. Is there was I think she's actually, I wasn't going to go and say who it was for, but she's actually said it herself, looking back at the old kind of Twitter thing at the time. So again, someone else who's there, Alison Dulles, had said, sometimes you have to break the law to change the law. And I said, but we're the party of government. Do we not legislate to change the law? And, it was like, if we don't follow the law, why should anyone else? And that seemed to me, maybe I was just naive, not being a politician, to be on this kind of body. But it really did shock me to my core, the kind of attitude that people have got as to how, how rigour in governance and proper procedure and just good practice seems to have gone into a cloud of groupthink, enabling groupthink, and that is the most dangerous thing where we're at the moment, is the groupthink, because it does dissipate at some point and you are left with no solid ground to stand on, and that's where I think we're rapidly getting to.
Well, that leads us on to this. Now, it's often said, so when Trump was elected in 2016, he promised to drain the swamp of Washington. When Biden was elected in 2020, he was on restoring the soul of America. And the SNP have been elected consistently on getting independence delivered. Mm-hmm. These are the sort of mottos and the phrases that we've heard, and these are the things that we've been leading on to. Now, Nicola Sturgeon currently is doing a weekly press conference on, I don't really know what, but it's like she gets up just to fight with the journalists because she's bored that they're not being very nice about her, so she's going to fight with them on live TV. I don't actually get the purpose of the press conference other than to say the NHS is doing a bit crap right now, but at least it's not as crap as the English one, which isn't a particularly high bar, very low bar across. So this leads us on to this thought of, is this it? If you are no longer saying, look forward, go on to the next big thing, exciting things are happening in front of us, because you don't hear that anymore. That's now done. We've passed the point where exciting things are getting proposed. If you have nothing exciting, nothing new, is this the end of Nicola Sturgeon? I mean, are we just waiting for Kate Forbes to get back off maternity leave and take over? Like, in all seriousness, are we just, Nicola's like, there won't be a leadership challenge and she's got plenty of fuel in the tank and everything's ready to go, but, is it? Where are we going? Where is the bus? What's the destination? What are we aspiring to? Is this the end of Nicola Sturgeon?
I mean, we've obviously talked about this quite a lot, just observing things, really trying to be objective about it, just looking at the actions from a strategy point of view, what's happening, usually say the direction of travel, if it's not new and going forward. There seems to be a lot of boxing in from previous positions, that she seems to be very much in react mode a lot of the time. I think the press conference was reactive. I don't think she really wanted to be there. It didn't come across at all in her kind of body language that she wanted to be there. She's doing a lot of interviews. I think she's finding it really uncomfortable. But I did kind of muse over, was it trying to get the kind of comfort zone back from the COVID press conferences where she got much adulation on that, and it was almost like trying to get that control back to kind of centre herself, because she's not somebody who does deal well with a reactive situation. You can see people who are very lateral thinkers, who are very, can off the cuff, deal with stuff and take stuff from a kind of backhander or what have you. There's a lot of scripting. You can see from the performances at Holyrood, First Minister's Questions, etc. It really seems like a very, very bad pantomime that's had, overrun. To see some of the First Minister's Questions, and I think that was probably one of the reasons she didn't want actually Alex Salmond back in the Parliament, because I think that would have been very, energising from a Parliament point of view. But I also think it would have just put a bit of kind of life back into it, but she would have been very, very uncomfortable. She would no longer have been the kind of star player. And I think it was the same with the kind of blocking of, the Westminster MPs in the 2019 election, with this weird dual mandate thing that seemed to be the biggest thing ever. And then suddenly the council elections, when I asked a question about NEC, was that going to apply there? Because there were so many councillors that were running as MSPs, and it was, well, I'll get back to you. And none of them actually did step down. They just kind of, I think some of them maybe did voluntarily, but certainly mine didn't. Mine was my councillor and MSP for a year. So it's just all a bit, well, is it really because, at the time people were saying about Joanna Cherry, Philippa Whitford, people like that, who would maybe have come in and actually added a lot of gravitas to the Parliament in Holyrood. And I think we're severely lacking. We lost a lot of experienced politicians in the 2021 Holyrood election, like my MSP Bruce Crawford, who was, an exceptionally good constituency MSP and made a huge contribution in the Parliament, particularly in the 2007 minority government, getting a lot of consensus. A very powerful Parliament who got a lot of cross-party consensus and did big things like the Queen Street Crossing and a lot of the kind of big bits of legislation, the SNP paint on walls now and on the stairs at conferences. A lot of that happened from that Parliament, or it was incepted in that Parliament. And we've lost people like that. And we've got some very inexperienced people in, and some of the ones I've seen recently on the media, you're actually starting to think, has your PR team left the building? I mean, some of the optics I've seen recently are absolutely dreadful. I mean, if somebody's advising Nicola, then I would suggest strongly to her, like, she really looks at their intentions, because some of the optics that have gone out recently are really not good for her as an individual. And I think, they're starting to talk about her memoirs and stuff. That all, everybody's thinking 9 years, Jacinda Hearn, when that happened, nothing in the tank, time to go. I think a lot of people thought, yeah, okay. But whether she wants to or not, and I feel she does, I really feel she looks as if she wants to be somewhere else. She wants to do something else, but can't quite see the leaving on her own terms, things falling into place yet. And I think one of the worrying things for Scotland, particularly for independence supporters in Scotland, is there is no clear succession path. And I don't mean that shouldn't be democratic, because I think what happened between Alec and Nicola shouldn't have happened. I think really democracy is important, and I think anointments of successors like Gordon Brown and Tony Blair and all that is not healthy for democracy. But there is no obvious kind of succession plan, like a team. It seems very, it's a one-man band or a one-woman band, and people are just in different roles, and as you said, they get shuffled about. But Derek Mackay, I think, was held up as a successor for a long time. Kate Forbes now in that role, but I think I can't see that is the kind of Nicola grouping would want Kate Forbes, although I think many people would think she is.
This is the other thing. So there's oddly, like in the United States, for example, the line of succession is considered, in fact, in the UK with the British royal family, the line of succession is considered absolute sacrosanct. Like, this is worked out. The minute one dies, like, you know who the next 5 are, because it could be important and could be relevant. The US at all times will have a commander-in-chief. The UK at all times will have a head of state. It's just some automatic process. The Queen died, and effectively the Queen is dead, long live the King. Like, I mean, it might take them a couple of hours to tell us on national TV, but it happened immediately. That, you know, there wasn't a heartbeat or a breath between the Queen dying and the King ascending to be the King. That was just automatic. However, questioning who your democratically elected leader of the whole of Scotland is seems to be out there. Now, John Swinney is the deputy, but he's the deputy in the sense that John Swinney has already been the party leader, and Nicola Sturgeon does not see him as someone who would challenge her.
No.
And I've noticed online, Nicola Sturgeon's lot were quite coy here. They were like, we wouldn't be having this discussion if it was a man. We're only having this discussion because it's a woman. Which is absolutely, first of all, it's nonsense, because we had this discussion the minute that Tony Blair, he was getting into his third term. The discussion happened about Tony Blair and whether or not he could keep going. So first of all, we need to drop the idea that this was some sort of misogynistic comment, because it was, you know, that was around the time I sort of became alive to politics, and it was them talking about who was going to succeed Tony Blair. The second thing we need to put here is people are saying that nobody would ask if a man had any more fuel in the tank to keep going, and it's somehow misogynistic to suggest that saying it for Nicola Sturgeon is against the grain. However, it's worth noting that those are actually the words of Jacinda Ardern. She said, "I have, you know, there's only so much fuel in the tank." She was the one that brought this forward, and you know, I don't think it's misogynistic. In fact, I think it is the fact that this demonstrates why we need strong female leadership in the world, is because I actually look to Jacinda, and she has achieved what she wanted to achieve. She's achieved in line with her goals, and she's saying, actually, now I don't have the energy or the political capital or anything to get anything more done, and it's now time I step back. And I think that if there's any lesson we should learn, it's not that men and women shouldn't speculate on whether or not Nicola Sturgeon is, you know, an empty tank or a full tank, but rather that actually one of the benefits of having female leadership is men have been stubborn in political circles and never really give up the mantle. I mean, Boris Johnson basically had to be grabbed and dragged out of Downing Street. Gordon Brown famously was called a squatter by the Sun for sitting in 10 Downing Street. I actually think it's a strong accolade that actually what women have taught us is, as a man, sometimes your time is over and you need to move, you know, it's time to move out the castle. And I think Jacinda has done a fantastic job, and I think there's something we learn there rather than it being a negative.
Well, Angela Merkel was the same. You know, who people would hold up to be a very successful, you know, leader on an international stage, and she left on her own terms as well. And I think that is definitely. I mean, we question, what do you mean have it in the tank? Have what in the tank? Surely that's really up to the electorate. And ideas in the tank. You know, what new ideas do you have? As you said, everything seems to be very much going around a bit of a hamster wheel. We're turning out legislation, things are not actually becoming law. We're, you know, ending up in more judicial reviews with dreadful track records at judicial reviews. People are struggling, there's NHS crisis. And we've got, you know, massive sell-off of our energy renewables, and nobody's talking about it. And we've got, you know, an energy crisis, you know, fuel crisis in an energy-rich country. All these things, and yet we're putting more money into judicial reviews that are not about independence. You know, there was no concern for this. I mean, one of the things I really want to say is that this can be fixed in Scotland. There's a part of devolution, the reconsideration stage is in the gift of the person who raises the bill, which is Shona Robinson, the Cabinet Minister. This could be fixed. You could actually show grown-up politics, show the tone, bring people together, go back to actually look at the core purpose of actually making people's lives easier, but without impacting reserved law, and actually having this thought process through. You can do that in quite an intensive way. It doesn't need to take another 6 years. But you can also give the police and those who have to implement this a chance to actually, you know, sit down and think about this and work out the outcomes and how this could possibly be done. Because otherwise, you're kind of kidding everybody on. You're kidding on, you know, you're making it into like a, you know, a democratic, you know, oh, it's discussing democratically. You know, we never heard that about the Supreme Court challenge. We were told, you know, they will honour the Supreme Court judgment. So, and then we're going to have a special conference about it with, you know, I think some, you know, multiple choices for the members that get to go there on Mother's Day in the Central Belt. So there's all these kind of contradictions that, you know, one minute we're listening to, the next minute really, when we say listening, here's your options that we've already pre-decided. But I do think there's a lot more people now starting to question, hang on, you know, this is in your gift to fix and get on with the job you were put in there to do, which is to deliver a democratic mechanism for the people of Scotland to choose their constitutional future. And, you know, I think they're going to run out of road very, very quickly. They're in a almost comfortable position, there's no election looming, but that's not in their gift. The Tories could have a surge for whatever reason. The Labour parties, we've said many times, are not unknown to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. It's within the Tories' gift. They could have a 6-week campaign at the time of their choosing, and I worry that it's been such a burach the way they have approached this that it will look like the people have actually failed independence instead of the politicians by actually properly strategising these options. There is it bursts your mind thinking about how many things could have been done with, you know, national conversations through like constitutional conventions, citizen assemblies, things that would have kept independence on people's minds with hope for we can do this better, here's a vision, here's a strategy. We talked before about Colin Wheel's vision for the first 10 years of independence. Really start to give people some genuine hope and not just black letters on a yellow banner in a conference. And, you know, that I think that's what really is so frustrating about everything, to be honest. But, you know, just to kind of close, our last little topic was, you know, is politics actually changing? Is it about just personalities changing, or is there an appetite to change politics? Because one of the things that actually did give me a wee bit of a kind of like spring in my step the other day is when I saw Elaine Miller, who was the lady who was doing the protest at the Parliament for Christmas that got in the press, and she's also a stand-up comedian and a physiotherapist. I actually went to her show at the festival. It was really entertaining, but also really informative about women's health. And she's now standing as the independent candidate in Corstorphine that Frank Ross vacated, who's the Lord Provost of Edinburgh previously. For SNP, he had resigned. So I think it's a Lib Dem, two Lib Dem men, and she's standing as a local candidate from 20 years, from living there for 20 years, you know, bring her kids up there and everything. And I thought, you know, I think our crowdfunder hit its target in 4.5 hours, which, you know, political parties would be, you know, delighted with. And I just think, is there actually a big appetite to really see a new politics and start to see, particularly at a local government level, independent people from communities stepping up and doing politics in a different way? And so I'm quite excited to see how that all plays out, and whether this is the start of enabling and emboldening other people to say, well, do you know what, I should stand up in my community. I've got something to say and can contribute, and I'm not aligned to any party politics. I just want to represent my community. So I don't know what you think, but I just thought it was really refreshing.
I think you're right. I think the party line has become so strong, and you see it in multiple parties. I think the Tories have burnt out at anything they've got. They've got nothing left to really give. I think who was it? Who was the famous guy? Who was it? I can't remember who, but someone who's, you know, some sort of star said, Rishi, it's time to let the Labour Party have a shot.
Oh yeah. Oh no.
Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Hang on. I don't know who you mean. I can't remember either. What were you on?
But anyway, you know, Rishi and the Tories well, there you go then. So they've run out of steam. The Tories have nothing left to give. The Labour Party, I don't even know what the Labour Party ideas are. They just seem to be bereft at any sort of life. It's like, oh, well, we're not the Tories, so you should vote for us. The Lib Dems are lost in a sea of absolute mediocrity. The SNP have forgot why the SNP exists. Alba, again, I don't think Alex Salmond is going to lead another, you know, charge into the Scottish Parliament. I think they could do with some new leadership and new sort of spring in their step. And they've not been helped by this odd salvo sort of hijack, sort of like, I don't know, there's a whole sect of random people who keep shouting salvo and that apparently through the various 10 organisations they've set up to support this think Scotland was already independent. They just need to find the secret scroll to decry it.
It's talking in a very small room as well. I don't think if people involved in independence get it, I don't know how the general public are supposed to get it. And it was Charles Faulkner I mentioned before. I couldn't remember Charles Faulkner. That's who it was. It was the Chancellor.
It's a whole pile of nonsense. I don't, the political leadership just isn't there, and it's like you say, you've got Elaine Miller, and she's, she took a stand at the Scottish Parliament and certainly made the news. Yeah. You've also got people like Mick Lynch and the sort of Enough is Enough, E-Bang people, and they've made a bit more of a stir. Although that's all kind of gone a bit quiet as well. And I think what we've done is we've reached the point where parties have become so conditioned and so perfected in their PR machine and so predictable in what they're going to say that actually the whole system's about to reset, and we're about to find out until some much more fun and much more alive characters with some actual ideas or some radical solutions. And you know what? Even if the radical solutions don't ultimately work, we are going to need governments that take a bit more risk than actually we've had a consultation followed by the representation, and we've done this and we've done that and we've passed this tiny little change to nothing. I mean, we've got the deposit return scheme, which should be a huge piece of legislation that wins for Scotland and technically accelerates us massively to a huge recycling powerhouse. And actually, local authorities have said, well, we can't take this increase in workload. The Scottish Government haven't actually defined the scheme very well to business. Half of Scottish business is busy saying this is a bit of a disaster coming towards us. And a lot of the businesses across England and Wales and Northern Ireland who trade in Scotland are saying we might actually have to stop selling product in Scotland because this is such a mess that we don't really know how to work it out. The Scottish Government abandoned the issue. It's been knocked into some sort of expert panel. The minister's missed in action. And it just, again, is like, oh, we had an idea about how we could be a bit greener, but actually we forgot to pad out the details. One thing I did find during the week that I thought was hugely amusing. Maybe it was only amusing to me, but I thought it was hugely amusing. Lorna Slater is a minister within the Scottish Government, and I'm going to look it up. I've got it on my phone here as well because this was an interesting thing that came up, and I was like, there's no way. What people have pointed out, there's an awful lot of overlap in ministerial responsibilities.
That's right.
Okay. So did you know, for example, here's something ridiculous. Lorna Slater is the Minister for Green Industrial Strategy, Green Skills, Circular Economy, Zero Waste Scotland, Nature Recovery, Nature Scotland, Biodiversity, National Parks, National Heritage and Plant Health. But anyway, would you believe we also have a Cabinet Secretary who looks after literally everything that Lorna Slater does? We have two levels of government that look after Plant Health, Nature Scotland, Net Zero, Energy and Transportation. We have National Industrial Strategy, Government Coordination of Infrastructure, Circular Economy and the Net Zero Policy. We have two ministers in government. Have you heard very much on our future, other than we come up with Scotland and by the way we lost all the money?
So conversely, we have got Michael Russell as the Minister for the Constitution, replaced by Angus Robertson, who's the Minister for the Constitution, Culture and something, what's the other one? Was it Home Affairs? And, if this is a country on the cusp of independence, would you not think you would really, Constitution would be pretty important, merit having, a minister feeling dedicated.
Its own department.
But would you not also be drawing talent across Scotland? Because to build Scotland, getting independence is step one. The real hard work is building an independent country and making an independent country that has got all the right foundations and mechanisms to thrive. To do that, you have to widen the net from the current political bubble, because we've got talent oozing across Scotland, some of it oozing out of Scotland because they are not getting opportunities here, which is so sad. But we really do need to look at what are the skills we need to do. Like if you're doing a project, you look at your kind of work breakdown structure. What skills and talents do I need to be able to do these jobs? this almost seems like the Lawrence Slater thing, to make it 2 Green Ministers, her and Patrick Harvey, it's like a solution looking for a problem. This is a solution. So we're just, oh, well, there's some roles there, not realising it. It reminds me of an organisation who will remain nameless, who I once consulted for, who had a director of Better. Everybody used to just think that was hilarious. How do you pass your assessment? How do you know you deserve a pay rise? Have you done better? Yes, I have. So it's just a bit of a nonsense role, and
I think
what the output, we should be measuring politicians on their output rather than their titles.
And I think that is our natural ending point there, is that we need clearer objectives. We need politicians who are a bit more radical than the ones we've got, and we need to stop with this absolute status quoing of, we've been told no about independence, so we're going to go around and play about with nonsense instead.
Yeah.
We need inspirational leaders.
Exactly. We have to listen and inform and question and challenge and normalise that again in society, because it really is the only way you progress. Groupthink.
Aaron Sorkin, Aaron Sorkin, who wrote The West Wing, actually wrote better leaders than we have.
Bring in President Bartlett.
Let Bartlett be Bartlett.
Yeah,
anyway, thank you everybody for joining us on this hour and 15-minute podcast. My name has been, my name hasn't been, I guess my name always is, Graham Spence. I have been Graham Spence. That's Alison, who's been Alison Graham. I hope you've had fun. Goodbye and good night.
Thanks, folks. Good night.